So the first speaker today is Phil McMichael. He's professor and chair of the Department of Development Sociology at Cornell University. His research focuses on food regimes and food sovereignty, the land grab, and rethinking the agrarian question. He has authored a number of books, including the award-winning Settlers and the Agrarian Question in 1984, and his most recent book, I think is his most recent book. I hope I didn't miss a more recent one, but in 2013, Food Regimes and Agrarian Question. Is that your last book? Okay, great. He's a member of the civil society mechanism in the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security, and has collaborated with La Via Campesina and the IPC for Food Sovereignty. And today his talk is entitled Connecting Local Struggles with Global Activism in Intergovernmental Arena, the Importance of the Food Sovereignty Narrative. Phil? Do you want to use this? Or you want
Well, thank you, Yvette, and thanks to John and Yvette for inviting me, and thank you to their crew that have been helping them put this whole affair together. It's wonderful to see friends, and it's great to be in Ann Arbor. I haven't been here before, so it's a new experience for me. I've got a bunch of slides, and I'm going to whip through them fairly quickly to leave some time for discussion. So, a quick outline: what's the food sovereignty narrative? How does it connect local and global activism, and the food sovereignty narrative and the Committee on World Food Security, which is situated in the FAO in Rome. Now, the context of the food sovereignty narrative is, and I always make this argument really strongly because I think it's important to emphasize that the food sovereignty movement is a counter-movement within the global food regime, or the neoliberal food regime, which is to say that it's not an independent, autonomous movement that just dropped from the skies. It actually comes out of the contradictions of neoliberal capitalism and the depredations of the food regime. So it's very much part of the food regime itself. It's a product of it, but it's fighting against it, of course, and as I'll say later on, offering an alternative vision. The structural adjustment programs that came in the 1980s triggered a global agrarian crisis. This is all part of the context. States were conduits and instruments of neoliberal policy that affected agrarian sectors quite seriously by dismantling supports for farming communities, etc. And during this time, food security was redefined as the right to purchase food, not the right to food, but the right to purchase food via transnational corporate-based global market institutionalized by the WTO in 1995. The right to purchase food idea came up in 1986 at the beginning of the Uruguay round. And of course, this WTO setup was overriding national food systems and national food policies. And then finally, and this is a term Peter Rossett likes to use, the cheap food regime displaced small-scale producers, and essentially what happened was that Europeans and Americans were dumping artificially subsidized grains in particular in the global south in markets and undermining the farmers in those regions. So in 2000, La Via Campesina said, and I think this is a very elegant way of capturing what the food regime is all about, it's the massive movement of food around the world forcing increased movement of people. And of course, there's a whole geopolitical architecture that's enabled this particular food regime to operate. The original La Via Campesina narrative said food sovereignty was the right of each nation to maintain and develop its own capacity to produce its basic foods, respecting cultural and productive diversity. A little bit later, they said the neoliberal agricultural policies have led to the destruction of our family farm economies and to a profound crisis in our societies. I've underlined there to try and make the point that it's not just about farming, it's about the society at large. And then Paul Nicholson said the main reason for the existence of La Via Campesina is to be the voice of the peasant movement. in all the global debates on agrarian policy. So again, there's a local connection implicit there. Just a quick slide on the internal organisation of La Via Campesina. Raj Patel makes the point that the absence of a policy-making secretariat allows La Via Campesina to sort of model a non-top-down organisation without sovereign authority over its member organisations. So it's very much organising in such a way as to subvert conventional organisational structures. Paul Nicholson said one of our internal debates is how to maintain political power at the three levels so as to keep the movement's horizontal structure, albeit at the expense of a certain international efficiency. And I'm introducing this quote simply to point out that it's very difficult to sort of manage an international coalition of so many disparate groups within a single structure to maintain the relationships among those organisations, those member organisations, but also to build some kind of efficient global presence, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the content of the food sovereignty narrative, it's not simply about peasant rights, it's also about social needs, which we saw a little bit earlier. But I always want to argue that it's very important to anchor food sovereignty in peasant struggles. And one of the issues there is that I know that John and Yvette want to talk about the North and the South vis-a-vis food sovereignty. And one of the problems in the North is that food sovereignty sometimes is understood as simply about consumption and access to healthy food and local food and things like that. And people forget the sort of history of the movement. And so that's an important dimension that I think we need to keep in mind. The narrative also denaturalizes claims for a private trade regime to feed the world. And I think in a very powerful way, this movement, and John alluded to this in his introduction, it problematizes what we understand to be the free market. And that has to do with the subsidy structure that allows northern agribusiness to undermine southern small-scale producers. La Via Campesina interconnects conditions of agrarian life and macroeconomic policy, and I've mentioned that already, originating in the structural adjustment and WTO liberalisation. The implications of the narrative. Well, first of all, I think it's important to emphasise how much the initial strategy identified state complicity in the food regime. In other words, governments that were supposed to be taking care of their populace and building public food policies according to La Via Campesina were actually complicit in, through the WTO free trade regime, complicit in allowing the expansion of export agriculture and the undermining of their agrarian sectors. The intervention that La Via Campesina made, I always feel like that it was a strategic essentialism. They used the term sovereignty, which is a very conventional term, but it was a way of sort of capturing people's attention and imagination and appealing to the idea that member states within an international organisation still should have a certain amount of self-determination, particularly with regard to food policy. So they also used the language of sovereignty to politicise the market regime, precisely to point out that these are states that are supposedly managing their own affairs and resources and shouldn't be subordinated to the market. And then finally, there's another understanding of sovereignty that I believe is very important, and that's that it invokes grassroots self-determination. So now there's a debate about at what scale should the right to self-determination operate. Well, as I said, the strategic essentialism of the sovereignty idiom, I think, reclaims lost juridical ground in the short run. It also problematizes agro-export complicity by states, which is intensifying today. The sovereignty idiom therefore reformulates state responsibility implicitly by making that critique. It also politicizes in politicizing the state's external and internal relations, there's a rethinking of food sovereignty as civic self-determination in the long run, and that's the vision, I think, as states are transformed within. Now, moving forward to this century, the development of the narrative has taken a turn, I think, following the food crisis, which unsettled the implicit rules of the food regime. Market-based food security is now problematic since 2008, and of course land grabbing is the most clear manifestation of that, where governments are simply going offshore and with financial investors also gaining access to lands elsewhere to grow food and fuel crops to bring back to their own countries, because food rioting in 2007 and 2008 showed that governments has suffered some legitimacy issues by not being able to provide food at decent prices for their citizens. So having access to food through land grabbing is one way in which governments attempt to manage their own legitimacy. For the food sovereignty movement, dispossession is now no longer simply about the circulation of cheap food driving them off the land, but also the circulation of money for land enclosures. And so now we're hearing about food sovereignty as land sovereignty also, refocusing on territorial and producer rights. So I would reformulate La Via Campesina's elegant statement and give my own semi-elegant statement. The massive movement of money around the world now forces the increased movement of people. And of course the two things are going together, but this is the more immediate issue. We've seen a mega farm invasion that Grain documented last year, where in 1960 40 million hectares of land were given to industrial crops. By the year 2011, over 180 million hectares for industrial crops. And soybeans, of course, are the second line there. So we see this kind of agro-industrialization that's occurring as part of this movement, and consequently we find the food sovereignty movement now talking about a real attack underway against our territorial memory, our memory of place, the spaces we give meaning to with shared wisdom and knowledge. Food sovereignty remains deeply pertinent and a source of profound hope as a tool to rebuild autonomy and the defence of our territories. The production of food from the smallest community level upwards is a vital proposal. Grain has this great graph which shows the vast majority of the world's farms are small, but they only have about 25% of the farmland. China's the one country where the percentage of small farms is pretty much close to the percentage of the agricultural area held by small farms at the same time. Displacement is one of the phenomena here, and what is the state? Who is the state to encroach on our lands? I think sort of captures what's going on in Africa in particular, because much of the land there is actually owned by the state and is held under customary tenure conditions. So the narrative is now refocusing the food sovereignty narrative. La Via Campesina condemned the ferocious offensive of capital and TNCs to take over land and natural assets, translating into a privatising war to steal the territories and assets of people and peasants and indigenous peoples. So in this context, I think we're seeing a new prominence now to the rights of small-scale producers to not only to produce food, but also to their models, to the sustainability and stability of their models of production as well as reproduction. And slipping in reproduction there is referring to access to the commons. And of course, along with rights come responsibilities. First of all, the movement's arguing that states should be stepping in to protect producer rights. But also the communities themselves are taking responsibility for bioreclamation, stewardship, responsibility of territories. And Priscilla Clay's new book on the human rights movement and the food sovereignty movement picks up on this very nicely, and in many ways it reminds me of Hannah Whitman's idea of agrarian citizenship, which I'll let her explain if someone wants to find out what that means. So territory and land sovereignty is now the focus. There's a growing resonance of the concept of territory in the food sovereignty movement. Priscilla points out the conception of autonomy is at the heart of the representation project. It's multidimensional, and it redefines what constitutes a good life beyond material criteria. Priscilla Clays did her PhD under the supervision of Olivier de Schutter, who was the human rights rapporteur for the right to food recently for the UN. Territorial-based agroecology as cognitive sovereignty, I think, is an important part of this, and I think Peter Rossett may talk about this tomorrow. And then the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, that's being debated in the UN, now spotlights land and territorial rights in opposition to capitalization of land as abstract space. The challenge of the territorial turn is, I think, identified very clearly by Clays. She says how Via Campesina will take up the challenge to keep advancing new rights while making them relevant for all of societies of great social relevance. And this, of course, refers to the need for alliances, the need to have non-rural, non-agrarian citizens understand the significance and importance of nurturing the land and returning the land to its social function, which is part of Hannah Whitman's idea of agrarian citizenship. So now we're in a moment where some people are arguing, like Clays, we're in a moment of defensive localism. There's a political opportunity shift by La Via Campesina, replacing international with local issues, such as land and resource grabbing, and that's the sort of the immediate threat. She argues there are new interpretations of food sovereignty emerging, more emphasis on the local and on alternative food sovereignty practices. Rossett emphasises the importance of strengthening member organisations, and there's a couple of issues. One is there's some concern about niche marketing with relocalised agriculture, and I think we see that more in the north as an issue of not necessarily addressing class and justice concerns always. And then Eric Holtermanez talks about the need to scale up farmer networks arising from his research in Central America on campesina networks. So the current narrative, Nicholson talks about proposing, Paul Nicholson's one of the sort of leaders of La Via Campesina in Europe, lives in the Basque Country. He talks about proposing local food markets and defending biodiversity and rural economies essentially. But at the same time, in 2008 at the World Food Summit, the IPC, which is the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, made the point that, made the global point that small-scale food producers are feeding the planet and, in fact, cooling it also, and we demand respect and support to continue. And so the IPC movement has been very influential in pushing the FAO to open spaces, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'm juxtaposing Nicholson's emphasis on the local there with the importance of emphasising the global significance of relocalising. Here's a picture of some of the folks at the World Food Summit that I was at. Food sovereignty countermovement. So this is an interesting issue here. What happened in following 2008 was that with the crisis, the food crisis, there was a certain loss of legitimacy on the part of the development agencies, and so the IPC, which had been working for years to gain access to the FAO, which is, historically mandated to take care of small farmers around the world, they finally forced the FAO to open up a civil society space within the FAO, within its reformed Committee on World Food Security, which I now work with. The Committee on World Food Security is regarded now as the foremost inclusive international and intergovernmental platform for food security and the elimination of hunger. Now, within the Committee on World Food Security, the civil society mechanism, which is a mechanism that brings together social movements and progressive NGOs as an organisation within the Committee on World Food Security that uses this new social space that's opened up to press for all kinds of rights for small-scale producers, indigenous peoples, agricultural workers, and so forth. And they were successful in pushing through the tenure guidelines, which recognised customary tenure, which was an important victory, and also were very strong on recognising gender inequalities. The IPC within the CFS was able to talk the FAO out of accepting the World Bank's principles of responsible agricultural and investment, which essentially supported investor rights, didn't think about and didn't include communities that might be affected. And so the CFS now picked up an alternative responsible agricultural investment principles, which were just hammered out over the last 2 years and accepted last October in Rome. And they're built around community and human rights, not investor rights, and promoting land rights and domestic food security. Some of the shortcomings within the CFS is the tenure guidelines accept the transfer of tenure rights as investment, even as the tenure guidelines have put up safeguards for process and impact issues to do with land grabbing. Tenure guidelines have been very effective in visibilising the customary rights of small producers and landless people, but nevertheless they're only voluntary and they're underutilised and monitored. And the CSM right now, and I'm part of this group, we're trying to develop some mechanisms for monitoring land grabbing. The RAI within the Committee on World Food Security, the Responsible Agricultural Investment Principles, in a sense, and this is my own critique, have fallen into a land grab trap because the deliberations over the last 2 years have focused primarily on financial investment as economic and therefore as good. In other words, what I'm getting at here is the language, the conventional language in the UN has not allowed for an alternative understanding of investment, which Mamadou Goita pointed out. For us, investment in agriculture is not an object of study, it's what we ourselves do every day of our lives. But the other part of this problem is that there's an incommensurability issue where large agribusinesses are lumped together with small producers for balance because they're all stakeholders in the CFS. And so what happens is that we lose sight of the difference that is so important in terms of understanding what's possible in the small-scale farming systems. The CFS has a high-level panel of expert report that argues smallholder agriculture is the foundation of food security, and also talks about the potential efficiency of smallholder farming relative to larger farms, which picks up on some of the work that Yvette's done with Catherine Badgley. So that's in their statements, but of course it's very difficult to get the conservative countries like the US, Canada and Australia and the private sector to get on board with that notion. So I was going to talk about smallholder role rethinkings. Yvette's giving me messages, I need to wrap it up. So what's happening here is that there's been a new focus on smallholders. The World Bank's getting in on the trick on this track, and they're arguing that smallholders need to be supported, but we'll do it through value chains. So they're trying to commercialise smallholders. And so the Committee on World Food Security, the kind of language that's used there is that they see smallholders as businesses in waiting, which is terribly insulting to the small producers that attend those meetings. They see farming as a profession, food security is about economic growth and entrepreneurship. The CSM representations of smallholders, and the second bullet I think here is the important one. They see small-scale land users as the main investors, as the majority producers of food, as reproducers of genetic diversity, domestic food security source to be supported with public investment, and low input sustainers of land as the public good. So the terms of the debate or the struggle within the CFS are around these kinds of issues, and it's really interesting to watch how this is taking place. When Agroecology comes up with the third bullet, those three countries always say you can't reference agroecology without talking about making sure that it doesn't restrain trade. So there's still this emphasis on trade. This is essentially my last major slide here. The challenges for the CSM, first of all, to anticipate food regime restructuring. So what I'm getting at here is that I think a lot of the constituencies are so focused on their specialised, the fisher folk, the indigenous people, the agricultural workers, that they're not able to have the resources or the capacity or time to think about the big picture. And this is where academics could actually play a really important role, I think. There's an international panel of experts on sustainable food that Olivier Deschutes has just started, which is part of this, I think, this kind of development. There's also the need to reform UN discourse for recognition of the difference of small-scale production and territorial integrity and what have you. And then there's a need for intensified alliance building, which I mentioned already, and the need to engage governments in regulating land use and recognising legitimacy and value of agrarian society. And I had some examples in India and Mali of organisations that are trying to put pressure on their governments to regulate, through naming and shaming, regulate land grabbing. I was going to talk a little bit about the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. While the CFS is talking about human rights and territorial rights and community rights, the G8 and the corporates are going around behind the back of the FAO and investing in large-scale and value chain farming. And you can see Bono there having fun with some of the big shots. So it's you can see the kind of thing that's going on. Food sovereignty narrative, my last slide. Human rights should trump property rights, redefines rights in collective, socially responsible terms, denaturalizes the view that small-scale farming is obsolete, co-production with nature, postulates an alternative civilizational political ontology that reaches beyond the food regime. Local struggles in these terms have universal input, and there's mutual conditioning. And so I see that in Rome, and you also see it at the ground level. The two ends of the struggle are developing ways to support one another. Okay, thank you.
So we have time for a few questions, if anybody has a question.
You were cut short where you were, at the moment you were going to the part I was interested in.
Thank you.
I think you had about some form of cooptation of the struggle for local farming by the industrial sector or by the financial sector. And my question is, I think this is going on both in the developing countries, the global south, and in the north. Can you elaborate more on these ways there is...
About co-option?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that the principal one right now, the principal vector is value chains and contract farming. And the World Bank's World Development Report in 2008, which is the first time the World Bank actually focused on agriculture in 25 years, which is quite revealing. They said that we need to have a new agriculture for development, and they're focusing on the smallholder as the new object of development. In other words, we're going to rebuild development from the bottom up by supporting smallholders. And the way in which they're doing it, of course, is that they're developing commercial networks around farming communities, bringing in agro-input dealers, selling fertilizer and seed, and promising markets for the products that the farmers focus on. Many of those markets are export markets. And the problem is that that while it in economic terms it appears to be a benign process, it's actually de-skilling farming, dispossessing farmers of their knowledge, telling them what to grow, how to grow it. Here are the seeds which you're going to have to buy every year, and so forth. So it's in that sense that I think there's a co-option process that's going on. And I always argue that I think it's part of the land grab. It's not a direct land grab process, but it's actually grabbing the farmer's land through transforming the knowledge on the farm that now becomes the property of the agribusinesses that are supplying the farm. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it, of course, is that there's been documentation that some farmers just can't hack it because they get into debt in that kind of process. So they lose their land. So it's another way of land grabbing. Jandal van der Ploeg from the Netherlands makes the point that many farmers around the world now are actually withdrawing from these debt relations because they can't survive like that. Then they're revaluing their farms as ecological wealth rather than monetary wealth. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. And he calls that repeasantization. And to me, it's an understanding that the modern peasantry of the 21st century is not like a traditional peasantry. It's a product of these contradictions, and So there's a new way in which farmers are learning to develop more resilience on their farm and recognise that in fact their ecological wealth is the sort of the bottom line. And he told me that he thinks about 80% of farmers in Europe are actually doing this, in varying ways. But he told me that there's more food now being produced in Europe under the radar than what's produced by agribusiness, and that's the power of local markets and this kind of phenomenon.
Maybe another short question? Anybody has any short?
Yes, up the back.
A short answer?
Yes. So you kind of defined the food sovereignty narrative as a countermovement between the neoliberal food regime. But I wonder what happens with the land tenure schemes that come from the colonial period in places like South America or India or other places of the so-called global south. Do you think that these problems that come from these systems of land tenure come into the narrative of food sovereignty?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think it's a continuation, and I would argue simply that colonialism was part of modernity and informed the idea that rural areas are backward and agriculture is secondary. Industrialization is the focus, and so if you industrialize agriculture, you have a modern economy. I mean, that's a very quick way of answering you, but I think you can trace it back like that. But what I'm trying to do simply with the recent food regime is to emphasize the way in which it has sort of taken hold of that notion and embellished it now with export agriculture as a universal principle. I mean, comparative advantage theory is essentially ruining the world because everybody's now being forced to compete with one another and find their niche. So so it is very much a historical legacy.
Okay, let's
Okay.
move on.